All right, recording. So what are we all concerned about? Sorry, I can't put on my camera. It's still not working. But how's everyone doing?
I guess I could start with a question I had. I was looking at this study guide and I'm looking at the question of how are the issues caused by abiotic factors different from that of biotic factors? And I wasn't entirely sure what direction I should take, but I was kind of thinking about maybe the difference between R selected and K selected species, but I wasn't sure if that was the right way to go.
So it could definitely have an influence on that. But it's not directly correlated 100% because, right, yes, part of it has to do with the fact that, our selected species, they'll distribute their prey and their offspring are most likely to die. So theoretically, that's most likely to do with biotic factors, but it could also be to do with something in the environment. So that's not a terrible direction to go. I guess for that question, more of the lines of what I was trying to get at with that is, the intricacies of the dynamics between biotic factors. So like, you have the different layers of symbiosis, mutualism, all of those positive factors, as well as predation. And so like those things are cycling, right? The life histories and populations of predators and preys are going to fluctuate around each other, whereas floods or salt are either something that's there or something that isn't, right? They're more of like a constant thing that the animal has to deal with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I see what you're saying now with where you're looking at like that being the difference between them. Thank you.
Could we go over how you can tell like if something's an invasive or keystone species from a graph? I think it was maybe like there was a concept question about that. I think it was about invasive species, but I don't know if you can tell a keystone species from a graph.
Let's see. I'm gonna go look and see what that question was. Let's see. We have, I think it would have been this one. No, not that one. Let's see this
one. Wait, I could take like a screenshot and then put it in the chat if that's helpful.
Sure. Yeah. No, not those.
It's question 4 of the community interactions, trophic dynamics, and food webs concept questions, if anyone wants to look at it on their own.
Okay. The food web one. Thank you. All right. Oh, okay. So two things about this graph, right? So the let's see. Yeah, so when you're looking at this graph, I guess I could pull it up and share screen. So when you're looking at this graph, what you'll notice is that you have these two species, right, that you're looking at. The way that you know that one is an invasive species is the fact that this rainbow smelt doesn't even appear. There's 0 of them in the population up until 1985. So the fact that they didn't exist in the environment and then they became part of it is one indication that it might be an invasive species. And then the fact that you have both of these species here interacting, and as one increases, it causes the complete decline of the other, would mean that it's an invasive species. If it was, if this blue graph was the opposite, say it was really high and then it started to drop and then both red and blue were disappearing, that would mean that it's a keystone species, right? It means that they were both plentiful in the environment, and then when one went away, they both started to, collapse in their populations. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to have you interpret any graphs about invasive species or anything like that. Cool. Let's see. So we have a question, which is, why are scientists concerned with survivorship curves? So let me pull up that. Okay. And then there's another question, which is the format of the quiz the same as last time? Yes, the format of the quiz is the same. I'm not going to have any of those like full paragraph fill in the blanks. I think it's hard to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of thinking with those. Because they can be a little vague. So I'm not going to have any of those. There'll be a few more multiple choice, and then a few more like short answers, but not any of the like paragraph fill in the blanks one. So here. So the question is, why are scientists concerned with survivorship curves? So scientists are concerned about it for a multitude of reasons. First and foremost, survivorship curves let us understand the life history and how organisms are surviving in their environment. So like, we're looking at this survivorship, these mock-up perfect curves, right? Like this is a type 1, that's humans. This is a type 2, that's bird. This is a type 3, which is, trees or any of those mass-producing organisms. We only know what those are because those generalized curves are because of survivorship curves. Like the fact that scientists started doing these life tables and going through cohorts and looking at how organisms survive allows us to have these generalized things. So it may seem a little like rudimentary, but like scientists do this for new species so that they can understand what lifestyles there are. So it has a lot of ramifications, right? We can use this data for a lot of things. We can use it ecologically to compare species. We can use it to track a species. If birds are supposed to have a constant death rate over their lives, if you suddenly are having, a scenario like with DDT, where the birds are actually dying much quicker than they should be, reanalyzing the survivorship curves lets us know that there's something wrong going on in the environment. And every time we find a new species, if we don't have one of these, we can make estimates of what their life history is and what's going to happen to them. We don't necessarily know what's 100% going to happen because of their because of all of those advanced interactions in the environment. The same species moved into a new environment with different predators could have a very different survivorship curve. And again, these are, if you remember the video with the sea turtles where they were tracking them and they were trying to talk about early sea turtle life, they wanted to know what was happening in this beginning part, like where they were, where they're being eaten, what's eating them, and things of that nature. And so survivorship curves can provide all of that information to us. In terms of these, what I'm going to want you to know is what kind of lifestyles of organisms are each survivorship curve. So if I give you a bunch of survivorship curves and I say, this an organism that produces a lot of eggs and doesn't take care of their young, which one of these curves do you think it would be on the graph? I want you to be able to interpret how an organism's life will affect the way this curve should look. You're welcome. Any other questions?
I guess just looking over at the study guide again, could we, I guess, kind of briefly talk about impeding and enhancing species interactions?
Sure. Let's find this. Where is that population ecology? Once. Oh, maybe that was the problem. Did I open the wrong one? Sorry, I'm having a hard time. There we go. No. Ooh, no. Let's see. Impeding interactions. Sorry about that. Let's see. Share screen. Right. So impeding and enhancing interactions, right? So environments have a set number of resources that organisms are competing for, right? And so those things could be shared resources, or they could be resources that each organism is taking in, right? So for instance, predators need nutrients. They're not going to be getting those from the environment. They're going to be getting those from eating other organisms, right? And so impeding interactions are the ability of one organism to outcompete the other and take, whatever resource they need. In some cases, in some environments, that's their lives, if they're going to be, predator prey. But it could also be as simple as, being able to, absorb nitrogen, or for instance, on on an agar plate, if you're growing bacteria like the ones that are shown here, the protists, they're going to both be trying to eat the same nutrients that are in that spot. And so one of them is a little bit better at collecting it than the other. What I want you to know about these impeding interactions is that kind of like what they look like. If I gave you a list and I was like, which one of these would be impeding, which type of organism is stopping the other from getting some type of supply of food. And to know that, organisms will grow with those life curves that we talked about, right? Those life history curves, those population curves, and they will grow to a certain point only under the best scenarios in which they don't have to compete for resources because of the limits on nutrition. And so as an example of impeding interactions, that's why I brought up invasive species. The fact that like competition can lead to the downfall of organisms. So again, these invasive species are out competing. And so they are a super intense version of this impeding interaction, right? They're out competing for resources and their populations aren't being culled. And so they are, this curve for our invasive species is just going to keep going up and up because they're not being stopped. In terms of enhancing interactions, I more want you to know about the fact that species can be very closely tied to one another and that they can rely on one another in order for these populations to go forth. So it can be stuff like symbiosis, in which two organisms are really closely tied and, they help take care of each other. But these enhancing interactions can also be, part of that food web idea, right? Feedback loops, a plant dying and returning soil to the earth is going to enhance the growth of other plants around it, right? There's some more subtle things that organisms do just being around one another. So for instance, like that would be like communalism, right? And two organisms where one benefits and the other neither benefits nor harms. So an organism dying, it returning to the earth is beneficial for another, but for it's not really doing anything. It's not affecting it. It died anyway. So I just want you to know that these two things are closely tied in food webs and trophic levels of things of that nature. Let's see. Chat. Oh, all right. So let's see. Then we had another question, which was how to think about question 22, which is thinking of a mock ecosystem of, say, 4 organisms. How many negative and positive feedback loops can you imagine? So this one is, and then what type of life histories do each organisms have? So this is kind of a, this honestly should probably have been the last question on the study guide because it's trying to pull together all of these ideas. So in my mind, what I was kind of thinking of when I made this question is think of like this food chain that's over here on the right. All right. So we have corn, grasshopper, frog, wolf, eagle, right? All of these organisms are in there. And so trying to think of negative and positive feedback, right? So for instance, negative feedback is going to be the frog is going to eat the grasshopper, the eagle is going to eat the wolf, which seems, I don't think that's right, but for this food chain, and then the wolf's going to eat the frog, right? So those are all going to be impeding interactions. Those are all going to be negative feedbacks in which the predators eating the prey is going to lower their numbers. You then have enhancing interactions, which would kind of be the opposite, right? So the more corn grows, the more corn that's able to exist is going to make it so that grasshoppers populations go up. And so the grasshoppers will be able to eat better. And so that's going to be a positive interaction. Also, again, corn is going to die. After a while, it's going to return to the earth. It's going to get broken down. And so it's going to be a positive feedback for bacteria and fungus decomposers. It's also going to provide nutrients for more corn to grow, right? And so that's going to be a positive effect. And so again, if you think about it, these positive and negative effects aren't just like good and bad. They have to do with a population increasing or decreasing. And if you are, and if you're continuing that trend, right? So you can have, let's say the corn dies out and you have a limited supply of grasshoppers or a limited supply of nutrients the grasshoppers can eat. As the frogs eat more and more grasshoppers, their population are going to increase. But the grasshopper population is going to continue to grow. If, say, the wolf population doesn't start to grow to kill frogs, maybe the wolves get wiped out by us, right? There's no longer anything to eat the frogs. You're going to have an issue like an invasive species or like the cane toad, where the grasshoppers are starting to die out from lack of food, but the increase in frogs is going to be positively reinforcing that death of grasshoppers, if that makes sense. And then the last part of that question was again trying to get at combining all these ideas. So like in this food web, what would you consider each of these organisms to be in terms of R versus K selected, right? So for instance, corn is probably R selected, produces a lot of spores, a lot of seeds, distributes them, hope that they are spread. The grasshoppers, once again, is going to be R selected because they're mass producing eggs. The frog also R selected. And so you have all these lower level organisms who are producing massive amounts of eggs, have a life history in which they are not taking care of their young. But then as you move up the food chain, you start getting those carnivores and those organisms that tend to be K selected, right? Eagles, birds are a little bit in the middle because, they're taken care of by their parents until they're able to fly. Then they go off. So they kind of have a mixture. That's why they kind of have that type 2 curve. But this wolf would be, a case selected organism. They're going to live in packs. They're going to, they're going to share food, and their young are going to be raised by the adults. So it's just kind of a thought experiment to try to see if you understand, feedback loops and then R versus K selected and stuff like that. And so theoretically, what I would like you to be able to do is like, if you were to think of like a simple food chain in anywhere, that you want, like a desert, come up with 4 organisms, you should be able to, say if you think that most likely, given your knowledge, if they could be most likely K or R selected, and then whether or not, one way that they can affect each other with either positive or negative relationships. I hope that helps.
Would we be able to go over like top down and bottom up keystone species, like what that means?
Sure. Yeah, so I think top down is the easiest to think of, right? Top down is thinking of the food chain, right? Top down is the top of the food chain, your apex predators. It's that idea, if you remove a predator, that an organism is going to overpopulate because they're not going to be kept in check. So in this case, we're looking at foxes. In this case here, we're talking about sharks, right? But I think the most real to life, or the one that you can think of, depending on where you're from, is probably deer. Once again, deer are an example of why top down keystone species matter, right? We don't have any foxes or wolves, so the deer are not going to be culled naturally. So they're going to just eat all the plants until they starve to death, right? That's top down. That means the removal of the apex predator is causing this cascading effect at the lower levels. The bottom up is the exact opposite, right? Something happens to an important food source. So In this case, what we're talking about is like salting the earth, destroying it, or not having fertilizer, making it so plants can't grow. I think the easiest way to think of a bottom-up effect is what happens in a forest if you remove all of the plants. If all the plants suddenly die, what happens to the herbivores? What happens to the omnivores? And so bottom up is removing nutrients through removing essentially a prey species. This could also be, if you were to say remove gnats or mosquitoes completely from an environment, all of those organisms that are relying on that species to eat are no longer going to be able to do that. And if there isn't, say, like this, if there isn't redundancy in the food web in terms of what organisms can eat, then you're going to have a problem, right? So for instance, frogs are eating all of these, are eating grasshoppers, butterflies, and fruit flies. But if you remove the fruit fly, this bird up here, which is only eating that, according to this thing I blocked out, is going to have a problem, right? That's going to have a lower organism that's going to have a cascading effect upwards. Luckily, there's a lot of redundancy in this. So generally speaking, unless you're doing something like, removing of plants or an entire organism that is necessary for food and higher levels, top down is more likely to happen. Bottom up, if that happens, is usually like an entire ecosystem is destroyed, which is unfortunate. Was that explanation good?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sweet. Yeah. Let's see. Cool. So another question we have is, why is predicting outcomes of biological disturbance complicated? And so, so I just want to pull up both of these to discuss that, right? So the reason that they can be complicated is because there's a lot of those feedback loops, right? There's a lot of interactions that we don't necessarily think of when we're trying to figure out, like even when you're brainstorming, say, for instance, right now, scientists are trying to do a thing where they're going to take mosquitoes that are genetically engineered to make it so that females of the species don't survive past gestation. So they have a special toxin in them that when females start developing, they get poisoned and they die. And so one of the concerns about that is, so we release these mosquitoes, and what happens if all the mosquitoes disappear in an environment? We don't know if those mosquitoes are going to be a primary food source for other organisms. It is possible that those mosquitoes have nothing to do with the environment. Like for instance, this government thing where they're sending out these trained mosquitoes, according to their studies, only about 3% of any particular organism's diet is mosquitoes. So the removing of them from the environment, at least the specific species that we're talking about, is not going to have a large effect. But mosquitoes, but say, for instance, a frog is not the only thing that mosquitoes are going to be interacting with, right? Those mosquitoes may be taking resources from other insects, for instance. And so perhaps the removal of the mosquito leads to an increase in the gnat population, which leads to a larger increase in frogs, which leads to a larger issue in terms of other organisms, right? So essentially, all of these feedback loops can be very dynamic, and which one dominates in an environment can vary based on a lot of things. So for instance, that hypothetical I just gave you about gnats, it's also possible that, we're having an especially cold winter, and so there aren't enough frogs to eat the gnats, even though there's a lot of them. Perhaps the frogs aren't gestating as much, having eggs. So when you think about ecological disturbance, it's not just biotic factors, it's abiotic factors, and it's it's all the allocation of resources and how they combined. And so that can be very, very different depending on environmental conditions, human interactions, and things like that. For that question, I mostly want you to know the intricacies that, that feedback loops can be positive and negative, that interactions can both be impeding and things of all of that nature. Just that is not as simple as remove something and it's positive or remove something and it's negative. If that helps. Cool. Oh, all right. So then let's see. We got another one. Let me open this. Oh, wait, no. Oh, this is the one I was looking for. All right. So, another question we had was, so for the one that's what types of organisms would you expect to continue to grow after they've reached maturity? So, right, we're looking at trade-offs, right? Before you're fully grow, before you reach sexual maturity, you're doing maintenance and growth. You're putting your resources there. Now, after you've reached sexual maturity, you can either do one of two things. You can reproduce, you can put all of your energy into reproducing and then keeping yourself alive, or you can continue to try to grow. And so when you're thinking of K versus R selected organisms, which do you think have the the lifespan and the resource allocation and the opportunity to really continue to grow and put effort into growing? Do you think a K selected species is going to keep growing after it's mature, or an R selected species is going to continue to grow? Does anyone have any ideas about that when we think about it that way? Who has the benefit of being able to have time and resources, right?
I would guess the K-selected species.
Exactly, right? So K-selected species, if you're an elephant and you're taking care of your baby, if you're living a really long life, right? If your survivorship curve makes it look so that you live to an old age and then die, you're going to be able to keep growing, right? Organisms, however, who are, spiders, insects, things like that, once they hit maturity, they're most likely not going to grow. And so, honestly, I'm not going to ask you that specific question, but if I was to ask you that, the argument can be made for certain species either way, right? So, for instance, there are selected species such as tortoises. They continue to grow for a very long time, even after they're mature, right? So species will often be in the middle here. But with that question, I was mostly trying to get at, our selected species are generally going to be the ones who, once they reach fully mature, they're done, they're going to mate, and then they're going to die, versus the case selected, which are going to keep growing and keep trying to do that. And again, it's complicated, right? For instance, this R selected mammal, those males are going to mate and then die, and so they are not going to continue growing. But the females of the species, who are going to be around for many seasons, I'm assuming they grow at least a little bit. They're going to continue to get maybe a little bit bigger throughout their lives. So a lot of organisms will be kind of in the middle, or it might vary, but that's what I was hoping you'd get from that. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Yeah, so the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is, this whole presentation about the fact that as you look at disturbances that happen in an environment in terms of environmental, as terms of human interaction, things like that, that if you have absolutely no disturbances or you have too many disturbances, both of those lower biodiversity. So the fact is that on one end, competition is what drives species extinction when there's no disturbances. Which creature is best made for the environment, which is going to survive, and things of that nature. When there's a high level of disturbance, there's just going to be natural death because of a changing environment. Not as easy access to materials, death of your prey species, removal of your home and your general, environment and things like that. So most organisms, if they're not adaptable, or if there's not some, genetic reason that someone is, maybe a little bit better, what if all of a sudden there's high disturbances, high fires, and there's no longer as much water, being held in the soil and the air? Maybe an organism that has a better time retaining water is going to survive, but all of the others that are incapable of dealing with this lower amount of water are going to die, right? They're going to start to die. And so the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is that when you have a balance between competition and changing environment, you have the creation of the most amount of evolutionary niches, right? You have the highest percentage. You generally find the highest diversity of species. Again, it's like thinking about the resources that are available in something like a rainforest versus something of a desert, right? When you have a lot of resources and diversity in an area, you're more likely to keep that unless, things go on. All right, thanks for coming. Sorry, someone said bye. Cool. Yeah, so for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, I'd like, again, it's all about these feedback loops and how, all of these interactions are much more complicated than just positive and negative. And so again, these are vague because they are vague terms that we use to describe a lot of different environments. And again, those environments are very dynamic and very different. What's happening in the oceans is completely different than what's happening in a desert. Okay. All right. Another question. So, what is the difference between density and dispersion of organisms? What can we tell about their lifestyles from these? So, Oop. Nope. 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 Where is this? Population ecology. All right. Oh. All right. So right. So there's two different things we talked about, which was total populations of organisms in their density. So density, is the number of individuals in a certain area, right? So how how many mushrooms are there per square kilometer or something of that nature. Dispersion is of those organisms, how are they distributed in an environment? So, again, you could have, hundreds and hundreds of mushrooms that are all clumped together, and that's what they do. Or you can have them all individually living. And so when you look at just a number of density, it doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story. And so the second part of that question is, what can we tell about their lifestyle from these? So when we look at this, and we look at patterns of dispersion, you can tell that a lot of an organism's lifestyle actually affects how they will be dispersed in an environment, right? So random organisms are living individually. They have nothing to do with each other. They may impede one another or something like that, but the organism itself is just releasing eggs, releasing something, and those organisms or those offspring are living on their own. So like random would also be like spiders. When spiders hatch and they leave and they fly away and they do that, they're going to randomly land somewhere. Organisms that are going to be uniform or clumped are more likely to deal with one another with other biotic factors. So for instance, clumped organisms are usually ones that exist together, right? So it could be a group of animals. It could be a plant that is very bad at dispersing its seeds, right? An apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? So if that apple isn't eaten once it drops off a tree by, say, a deer, if it's gonna grow, it's gonna grow right next to it. And so depending on whether an organism is clumped or random, you can kind of tell about their life history or the way that they disperse their young. And so when you look at stuff like uniform dispersion, like those are organisms that may have to either, they have territory, right? They are working together kind of like a clumped organism. But they're also, have their separate spaces. So again, penguins group together a lot, but ultimately they will then separate and they each have their own little section and their own territory. Same thing with wolves and bears. They will mark their territory. They'll pee on things so that other bears know not to come around that area. And so then that bear, has their uniform, equally distributed territory. And so in terms of these types of things, what I want you to know is ideas of things that will limit distribution, right? So like think about think about what would happen, I'm trying to find the density dependent. So yeah, so I want you to know about like density dependent and independent factors, right? Like why is it negative? Why is it, what is positive and what is negative about living in a colony? If you're living in, say, in, this uniform area or a clumped area, what are negative things that can happen, right? What, why is it called density dependent? Why does increasing the density of organisms lead to, a limiting factor or a death, right? Because again, if there weren't any limiting factors, density or independent, right, populations would grow exponentially forever. You're welcome.
Professor, will there be any calculations or math things that we have to do?
No, you're not going to have to do any math for it.
Okay,
Yeah, so
thank you.
don't yeah, so in terms of right, what was on it? The where is it? Yeah, like the Simpson index and all of that stuff about biodiversity and things like that. I'm not going to have you calculate that. In fact, I'm not even going to ask you about Simpson index and stuff. But no, you're not going to have to calculate anything. I'm mostly interested in you interpreting scenarios.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could we go over primary versus secondary succession?
Sure. Right. So I'm going to start with secondary succession because I think it's just easier to visualize. So succession is the buildup of a community from essentially soil and nothing, right? Secondary succession is when a previously inhabited area, such as a forest, is destroyed for one reason or another. It could be like the Vassar Preserve, where it used to be a forest, we turned it into a farm, and now we're slowly letting the nature reclaim the area and build back up. And so what I want you to know about succession is this gradual process of, plants starting life again, plants building up, plants, working together to provide nutrients in an area, but also start making it hospitable, right? Again, we have these feedback loops and we have these food chains that need to build up. Plants can live anywhere, they're producing their own food, but all of the higher level organisms, such as, and I'm sure a botanist would be very upset that I put it that way, but all of the animals that are feeding off of those plants can't survive without them, right? And so you have this slow process of annual plants coming up, and then grasses slowly building up, then shrubs and trees, because again, if there's not a good amount of nutrients or a good strong soil, trees won't be able to grow, right? They'll fall right over things like that. And so this is the process that happens in these environments when we leave them alone and allow them to build back up. They will slowly go through this. Primary succession is the same as secondary, except this first part here, it was not a previously inhabited area. There is no base soil for plants to grow out of. And so the best example for this is these volcanoes, right? The volcano is going to have molten lava. It's going to shoot it out. It's going to flow down. It's going to start to harden, and it's going to become ground. And now organisms can live on that, but they may not necessarily be the nutrients necessary for things to grow immediately. There may not be enough soil. So I haven't gotten into this. We'll get into it in the last section when we talk about soil. But there are very different types of soil. So like dirt versus sand versus clay are all different sizes of soil particles. And so you need to have a certain amount of material, a certain type of material for plants to grow, right? If the soil is very, very loose, if it's sand, if it doesn't hold water well enough, plants aren't going to be able to, constantly get water. They're not going to be able to grow. There's going to be a limiting factor. And so in primary succession, you have this initial buildup of soil in one way or another. Again, it can be soil that's simply coming from an area next to it. If you say had, a forest that's next to this area that the volcano blew up in, or it can be erosion. It could be sand being brought over and then it builds up, and so do seeds, or the rain slowly causes that new molten surface to break down, and it goes from being a rock to slowly being worn down into sand, which will then hold a little bit of water, and then you slowly have these pioneer plants, and then secondary plants, and then herbivores and larger trees. Yeah. But I think it's important you know about succession. But the biggest part of this this specific presentation would be the intermediate disturbance hypotheses. what is ecological disturbance and what is meant by this intermediate and why is it important in that aspect. Not going to be too much on the succession. But I would like you to know about, types of diversity. So like species diversity, genetic diversity, how there could be certain pitfalls and things like that. There are, besides disturbances, there are other limiting factors, right? Biotic and abiotic, and within species, within populations, and outside of them. I'm not going to ask you for this to do anything like, right, what is it? Like I think it was a concept question where I asked you to like all of these different like questions. It was like, oh, what are each of these? Like what branch of ecology is each of these? I'm not going to ask you things like that. I'm gonna ask you questions like, here's a creature doing blank, and then I'm gonna ask you about, what about keystone species? What about these loops? What kind of control do you think this is? How does dispersion patterns match types of organism life and things like that? And then how organisms, allocate different resources, right? How is the how are organisms that seem to be very similar, such as these lizards, how do they utilize resources differently in order to create like their own environmental niches? Niche.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, like when organizations or groups of people go out to regrow an area, like plant trees, shouldn't they be? I feel like they always plant like the same type of plant or tree, but shouldn't they be doing different kinds of trees because then more animals can live there? Because I feel like the conservations look really not natural, I guess.
Okay, so that's a good point, right? So like if we're going to many different places, so yeah, so it depends on what's happening in that area, right? It might be that those are, I'm not sure about it, but it might be that those are good starter trees. Like in the process of like this succession, they're like good, like young oak and hickory trees. They might be species that are better at starting biodiversity. You're right. Like it would make more sense, right? If you're planting, why not just plant like 10 different species and have some diversity in there? So I'm not sure. It might have something to do with that. It might also have to do with the area that they're in. Perhaps, they don't want certain species. They might not want to introduce what could possibly be an invasive species if they don't know, what like if another tree might completely dominate. There might be like safe bets for trees or a species that we can introduce that don't necessarily take over, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. It also could be like we don't have enough science, like this is how we do it now, right? We need to, one day we'll figure out that we need to plant more. It may be like a hump, right? Like we're going to learn in that way. Because even in this, like secondary succession, right? The trees won't naturally pop up in an area for a minimum of 5 years, right? It could take, 150 years in order to reach those fully mature trees and that like fully sustainable environment.
Sorry, could you repeat that? My dog was barking in my ear.
I was saying that the process of ecological succession is like not a fast one, right? Like if you look at this graph here, for instance, you know, it could take 150 years for a diversity of trees to like all grow up and be stabilized. Um, right? Because like in this case, you know, in this succession, you have all these mature trees, but you also have smaller trees, you have these grasses and possibly flowers around. And so it's going to be a stepwise process. So I think there's probably something like that. You have to ask a more important. Actually, I think is it I think yeah, Vassar is doing, is it this weekend or the next weekend? They're doing like tree planting at the preserve. I think I was planning on doing that. Maybe ask that question about how different trees, you know, might be better for biodiversity.
Okay, thank you.
Could we also go over why it's important to realize that biodiversity is in constant flux?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. So the reason that I was mentioning that one is just because I again, it's just trying to get at this idea that these interactions between organisms are very complicated, and that if you remember when I was talking about that, like that or showing you that video, right, about the Cambrian explosion, where after we had this oxidizing event, it looked like biodiversity hit a low, right? Almost all these organisms died in the in the frost in like the, you know, the global ice age. But after that, biodiversity became even higher, right? After we had more oxygen in the environment, plants could grow, we had more diversity. And so I just wanted you to think about and realize again that like biodiversity is constantly in flux because organisms are constantly dying, new species are being added and removed from environments. A big event could completely destroy biodiversity but lead to a higher amount of biodiversity. And so just the idea again that it's very complicated, and that, you know, a low in biodiversity isn't necessarily the end of the world, right? Maybe in a particular ecosystem, it might be really bad. But overall in the world, things are going to flux. And, you know, we try to save every species and organism we can, but it's impossible. And naturally, even without us, we're gonna, in the next group, we're gonna talk about like global change and things we do to the planet. But like even without us, the world is changing. You know, there is a little bit of hubris in humans where we're like we have to save every species on the planet no matter what. Like that. For instance, right? You know that 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 like this, this mammal I was talking about, right? Even without us, naturally occurring forest fires, destruction of habitats, and shifting of insect populations are making what was once advantageous completely unadvantageous. And even without us, these organisms are starting to die out. And so, it's a natural cycle. And so something will hopefully fill that niche. Obviously, that doesn't mean that we should ignore it, right? We should be cognizant and pay attention of our effect and how we're doing it. But again, it's constantly in flux.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, how are the issues caused by abiotic factors different from those of biotic factors? So I discussed that a little in the beginning. So what I was trying to get at with that is, the fact that when we discuss abiotic versus biotic factors, biotic factors are complicated interactions between organisms, right? So you have predator-prey interactions, you have prey specialization, you have all of these other mechanisms. All these other mechanisms that are, organisms are competing for resources. And so their relationships can be very dynamic and robust. Whereas with abiotic factors, they're just something that exists in the environment, right? The organism has no control over it. It's not a living thing that's actively attacking. Say, for instance, this adorable animal here is limited by predators, right? There are predators who are actively coming for it. There's something that's trying to kill them. They can avoid those predators, and thus they're able to live in like different environments where predators are. They're able to move and migrate. But if they were, say, being killed by a poison in the environment, unless they figure out what that poison is, they're most likely gonna, die from it, right? There's abiotic factors are those that are just in an environment and innately going to affect the organism. There's salt, there isn't salt. So just like the level to which they're affected and what kind of factors are each of them is what I was getting at with that. And so like and so what pressures do they put on organisms? So like what kind of pressure, evolutionary pressure, does a predator put on versus having too much salt in an environment, right? Dealing with like finding ways to not deal with the salt, or finding a way to, have your homeostasis and eat it too, right? Pump those salt out of your body, some type of physical acclimation to it. Whereas a biotic factor is like, you can run from a predator, you can run from something, but like if you can't find any leaves to eat, that's going to be a completely different issue. Any other questions? Overall, how are we feeling about this unit? Sweet. Mm-hmm. Overall, how did we feel about the first quiz? Did it seem fair? Did we feel like the study guides were preparing us for the material right and stuff?
I thought it was good. I liked that there was a study guide.
Okay, thank you. Cool.
I like that there are concept questions at the end of each PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, because I try to make the study guide off the presentations, and then the test off the study guide. So I try to have that stuff. It's just hard because there's too much to ask. There's just too much. Let's see.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Adam and Zoe, do you two have any other questions? Or Zoe, it's just me and you.
No, I don't have any more questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. You have any more? Feel free to email me.
All right, thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.